The Enfield case, the image that terrified England. Perhaps no case of touching or flagrante delicto has sparked controversy and attracted as much attention as the Enfield case did. This is due to it being one of the rare cases that has been well documented with audio and video and whose heroes are still alive and kicking. Everything started from this humble house. The story began in a small rented house in the London suburb of Enfield, and its heroes are a divorced woman named Margaret Hodgson and her 4 children, Peggy, 12 years old, Janet, 11 years old, Johnny, 10 years old, and Billy, 7 years old. One night in 1977, the mother sent her children to bed early and sat watching television alone in the living room. After a while, she heard a noise coming from her daughter's room on the 2nd floor. She shouted, demanding that they stop playing and go to sleep. But the noise continued, so Mrs. Hodgson got up, overcome with anger, and went up to her daughter's room to scold them for not sleeping. But as soon as she opened the door, she saw the 2 girls sitting silently in the room. They slept while looking in horror at the heavy wooden wardrobe that had moved from its place against the wall and settled in the middle of the room. The mother was amazed at this and slowly pushed the wardrobe until it returned it to its place. But as soon as she moved away a little, the wardrobe moved again on its own and returned to standing in the middle of the room. It was terrifying, and the mother had a strange feeling that there was someone with them in the room, an invisible person. Then she heard 3 consecutive knocks on the wall, after which a short silence prevailed. Then the knocking came again, but on another wall. The mother, terrified by what was happening, took her 4 children and went to her neighbor's house to seek help. The neighbor sent her husband to investigate the matter. This husband was called Vic, and he was a large, strong man who worked in the construction field. He entered the house and looked around. At first, he did not notice anything out of the ordinary. Then he heard a knock on the wall, so he went up to the 2nd floor in search of the source of the sound. To his great astonishment, he followed the knocking upstairs. Rather, it followed him like a shadow wherever he wandered around the house. So the man was overcome with fear, but he took courage and went down to the basement, thinking that the source of the knocking might be a malfunction in the water pipes, but the pipes were intact, and despite this, the knocking continued. The man fled back to his home. Mrs. Hodgson described seeing her neighbor at that moment, saying, "I have never seen a man of this size so terrified in my life." The chair moved on its own. Finally, Mrs. Hodgson called the police. A male and female policeman came and searched the house for a long time, looking for the source of the knocks on the walls, but they did not find anything. Then suddenly one of Mrs. Hodgson's sons shouted, pointing with his hand towards a chair in the living room. Police officer Caroline Hibbs described what she saw at that moment as follows. "There was a chair next to the sofa. I looked at it and noticed that it was shaking violently. Then it started moving on its own until it settled against the kitchen wall. It walked for a distance of 3 to 4 feet before it stopped." The 2 policemen examined the chair carefully, looking for a clue or a trick, but they did not find anything. They were terrified and quickly left after telling Mrs. Hodgson that what was happening in her house was not within the jurisdiction of the police. In the following days, the frequency of mysterious events increased in Mrs. Hodgson's house, and the news quickly spread in the neighborhood until it reached the ears of the press. So 2 reporters from the Daily Mirror newspaper came to investigate the case, and one of them described that visit, saying, "There was complete chaos. Things were flying in, the air on its own, and people are screaming in terror." After the report was published in the Daily Mirror, reporters flocked to the family's home. The British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, even sent a team to record the mysterious sound of knocking on the walls. But when they returned to their workplace, they found that the metal parts of their devices had been damaged in a mysterious manner, and all the recordings had been erased. Maurice Grow spent with the child, Janet. After several weeks, Mrs. Hodgson contacted the British Society for Spiritual Research in the hope that they would help her. The society sent 2 of its investigators, Maurice Gross and Guy Leon Playfair, who later wrote a book about her experience at Enfield. Since their first day with the family, the 2 investigators saw very strange things. Detective Morris says that he saw Lego cubes floating in the air, and when he held one of them it was hot, and he saw the furniture move and move on its own, and he saw a shirt on the table rise and float in the air. The investigators quickly realized that most of these strange events were centered around Mrs. Hodgson's two daughters, especially the youngest daughter, Janet. Everything was going crazy in her presence, furniture moving on its own, objects floating in the air, iron bars twisting, water cups filling on their own. It's the same. The books appear and disappear. The television turns on by itself. The huge stone fireplace comes off the wall and rolls down to the middle of the room. Everything revolved around Janet, and her family and some neighbors swore that they saw her flying in her room. Then she began to enter into an unconscious state resembling epilepsy, during which she became extremely strong, to the point that she once pushed a journalist and threw him into the air, a distance of 4 meters. She began to speak in a hoarse voice coming out of her mouth without moving her lips. It was the voice of an old man, tired and frustrated, and with the appearance of this voice, the two investigators realized that they were facing a case of demonic possession. So they began talking with the voice, or rather with the entity that took on Janet's body, and recorded those conversations on CDs. And through those conversations they learned that the owner of the voice was an old man named Bill Wilkins. He lived in the house for many years, and he died alone of a stroke. In one of his conversations, he described how he died, saying, "Before I died, I went blind and had a head bleed, so I felt sleepy. Then I died in the chair next to the stairs in the basement." One of the pictures shows Janet shaving in her room. The strange thing is that Janet did not remember anything that the spirit said on her tongue after she came out of the state of unconsciousness or confusion, as if she was drugged or asleep. To ensure that the girl was not faking a change in her voice, the investigators made her drink a little water and keep it in her mouth during the period when the voice spoke on her tongue. They also consulted a throat specialist who told them that the possibility that the girl was faking speaking with this thick voice without moving her lips seemed impossible, because this will inevitably lead to the destruction of her vocal cords within a few minutes. The strangest thing about the matter is that someone called Detective Morris several months later and told him that he was the son of Mr. Bill Wilkins, and that his father had actually died in Mrs. Hodgson's house many years ago. One of the pictures shows the spirit throwing the two girls to the ground from their beds. During that period, the two investigators also installed sensitive cameras in Janet's room. These cameras would work automatically in the event of any strange movement inside the room and would begin taking pictures, one picture, every quarter of a second. Using these cameras, the two investigators were able to take a group of pictures that baffled and terrified many people in England at the time. And over time, they turned into an icon for all cases of flagrante delicto and demonic possession. Some of these pictures showed the furniture and furnishings moving on their own in Janet's room, and some of them showed Janet flying in the air inside her room with a look of horror and terror written on her face, as if there was a hidden force carrying her and moving her around the room, a powerful force that Janet once said about in an interview with Channel 4 in England. "I was led by a hidden force that no one could understand. I really don't like to think about it much, and I'm not sure that it was really evil. She probably wanted to become part of our family. She didn't want to cause harm. Bina, she had died at home and wanted to be left in peace. The only way for her to communicate with others was through me and my sister." One of the recordings of the voice, Bill. The recording is a bit scary, so there is no need to play the file if you are afraid of these things. The strange events in the Hodgson family home continued for about 14 months and began to gradually subside starting in the fall of 1978. There were sounds and knocks from time to time, but not like the first. Janet was no longer exposed to bouts of possession. Then she married early at the age of 16 and left home. In general, the future was not kind to the Hodgson family. The son Johnny died young at the age of 14 due to cancer, and Janet also lost her son, who died in his sleep at the age of 18. As for the mother, Margaret Hodgson, she lived in the house alone after her children left until she died in 2003. After the death of Mother Margaret, a new family inhabited the house, also consisting of a mother and 4 children. They did not know anything about the history of the house, and it was not long before strange things reared their heads again. The mother said that she felt that someone was constantly watching her, and her children said that they would wake up late at night to the sound of people talking on the ground floor, even though everyone in the house was asleep. One of the sons said that he woke up one night to see a scary man standing over his head and looking at him in a strange way. This incident was enough for the family to pack their bags and leave the house without returning. The house is currently occupied by another family who refuses to talk to reporters. As we mentioned, the Enfield case was documented in audio and video, and there are dozens of witnesses to it: neighbors, journalists, police, spiritual investigators, etc. But all of this did not prevent skeptics from appearing, and they had their arguments and evidence. They believed that all the strange things that happened in the house were the invention and fabrication of the two sisters, Peggy and Janet. These strange things would not appear without the presence of the two sisters and would only happen in their room, especially Janet, who some described as very, very smart. Indeed, the two girls were caught on several occasions fabricating evidence. Morris himself once caught them twisting spoons, which they later claimed was Belle's spirit that had twisted them. On another occasion, an American magician who visited the family to check what was going on was able to catch Janet trying to deceive him. As for the picture that shows Janet flying in the air, in the eyes of skeptics, it does not contain any strangeness, because it is just a picture of a girl jumping in the air from her sleeping bed, and the strangeness of the picture disappears completely if we know that Janet was a member of the gymnastics team at her school. As for the issue of voice, some experts say that a person can change his voice and produce sounds from his stomach with a little training. It is not an impossible issue as some people think. As for the reason for the two girls doing these tricks and games, skeptics attribute it to the desire to attract attention and to the emotional emptiness caused by the separation of their parents. Hodgson family photo. Janet herself, who is today a woman in her 40s, admitted in some interviews that she and her sister actually practiced deception sometimes, but the percentage of things fabricated by them did not exceed 2% of the total events that took place in the house, and they did this for two reasons. The first was to examine and test people's abilities. They were investigating the case to find out whether they were really good at their work or just charlatans. The second reason was to satisfy the many visitors who were coming to the house, expecting to see strange things. Other than that, Janet insists that most of what happened in the house is real. As she said in a newspaper interview in 2007, "From my own experience, I know that it is real. This thing was living on me, on my energy. You can call me crazy or deceitful if you want. But those things really happened, and that spirit was truly with me. And I feel in every sense of the word that it will always remain with me."
She also says, "I was terrified on my way home from school. The front door will definitely be open. There will be people coming in and out, and you cannot predict what will happen. I was very worried about my mother because she had previously suffered a nervous breakdown. At school, they used to tease me. They called me the ghost girl and put a fly rod under my back without me knowing. As for my brother, they called him the weird boy from the ghost house, and some used to spit on him in the street. As for the reason for the strange things happening in her house, Janet believes that the reason is that she played Ouija with her sister a few days before the events began, and that this opened the door wide for that mysterious, hidden entity to enter our world. It is worth noting that Janet was admitted to a mental institution in 1978, and complete tests were conducted on her mental and psychological well-being, and the results were fine.
All these events became a real story for England, as stated by experienced paranormal investigator Maurice Gross. From my own experience, I know that it is real. It was something that subsisted on me, on my energy. You can believe me crazy or deceitful if you want, but these things are happening now because the Spirit was truly with me and felt in every sense of the word to always be with me. In one of the journalist interviews, a girl, Janet, said, I felt terrified when I was returning home from school. The door will inevitably open, there will be people coming in and out, and you can't predict what will happen. You worry so much that what is already obvious will lead to a nervous breakdown. They would tease me, they would call me the ghost girl, and they would put the fly rod down without him knowing. But my brother would call him the weird boy who showed up from the ghost house, and they wanted them to spit on him in the street. All these events and developments in this house, as the days passed, a new family decided to live in the house, and they did not know anything about its history, and the events began to happen again.